She still argues like she owns this house, my daughter-in-law said, laughing lightly as she passed around slices of birthday cake. And that was the moment I realized respect isn't demanded, it's withdrawn. The room was filled with helium balloons and the smell of vanilla frosting. My grandson's 8th birthday banner taped slightly crooked above the fireplace I helped pay for 22 years ago, and yet somehow I felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Melissa didn't lower her voice. She didn't need to. The words were meant to float, soft and poisonous, just loud enough for the other parents from school to hear. A few of them smiled politely. No one corrected her. My son Daniel stood beside her, one hand resting on the back of the couch, nodding absent-mindedly, as if she'd commented on the weather. I watched him more than I watched her. He avoided my eyes. That told me everything. I had spent years explaining myself in this house. Explaining why I kept certain china in the cabinet. Why I preferred the thermostat at 72 degrees. Why I believed Sunday dinners mattered. Every disagreement turned into a quiet courtroom where I stood alone, presenting evidence that I belonged in the life I built. That afternoon, I felt something inside me settle. Not anger. Not heartbreak. Just clarity. The mortgage statements still had my name on them. The property tax bills arrived addressed to Evelyn Harper. The deed, locked in a small fireproof box upstairs, bore only one signature, mine. After Thomas passed 3 years ago, the lawyer had been very clear. Everything transfers to you, Evelyn. I remembered the weight of those papers in my hands, how Daniel had squeezed my shoulder and said, "We'll take care of you, Mom." Somewhere along the way, that sentence had reversed itself. I had become the one trying to prove my usefulness. Melissa continued smiling as she handed out plates. "It's just hard when someone won't let go," she added, almost sweetly. The other mothers shifted uncomfortably. I noticed the way the afternoon light hit the hardwood floors. Thomas and I refinished ourselves one summer, sanding until our backs ached, laughing when we tracked dust through the hallway. I noticed the family photos lining the mantel, birthdays, graduations, Christmas mornings, all anchored in this living room. And suddenly, I understood something simple and brutal. I had been arguing for a seat at a table I owned. I set my fork down carefully on the paper plate. I did not defend myself. I did not remind her who signed the checks. I did not list the years I had sacrificed so Daniel could attend college without debt. Silence felt unfamiliar at first, like stepping into cold water. But it steadied me. Daniel glanced at me, perhaps expecting a rebuttal, a tight smile, a strained explanation. I offered none. Instead, I looked around the room one last time, not as a woman pleading to belong, but as a homeowner taking inventory. Respect, I realized, isn't squeezed out of reluctant hearts. It is reflected back when ownership is clear. And in that moment, while children ran through the hallway and candles flickered on a bright blue cake, I stopped arguing. I waited until the last of the guests had gathered their purses and paper plates before I began clearing the living room, moving slowly, deliberately, as if I were tidying up after any ordinary Sunday. The balloons brushed against the ceiling with soft tapping sounds each time the air conditioner turned on, and I noticed the thermostat had been lowered to 68 degrees, cooler than I preferred, a small adjustment I had once argued about. I did not touch it. Daniel carried empty soda bottles to the kitchen without speaking to me, and Melissa knelt beside my grandson, helping him count the gift cards he had received, her voice bright and animated. I washed plastic forks under warm water even though they were disposable, more out of habit than necessity, watching the thin stream circle the drain. For years, I would have approached Daniel after a comment like the one she made, asked him quietly why he allowed it, reminded him of the mortgage payment I had covered when he was between jobs, reminded him of the down payment his father and I had made when he insisted on moving back home to save money. I would have searched his face for reassurance that I still mattered. That evening, I said nothing. Instead, I climbed the stairs to my bedroom and opened the small fireproof box inside the closet. The combination had not changed in decades. The metal clicked open with a familiar sound, and there it was, the deed to the house on Maple Ridge Drive, 3 bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms. 2,400 square feet, purchased 31 years ago for $189,000. Only one name appeared beneath the legal description. Mine. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the paper rest on my lap. I remembered signing the refinance documents after Thomas fell ill, taking full responsibility, because we both knew what was coming. Daniel had been grateful then, promising that we would all share the home one day. Share had slowly become assume. Assume had quietly become control. Downstairs, I could hear cabinet doors closing, the muffled hum of the dishwasher starting its cycle. Melissa laughed at something Daniel said, and for a moment, I imagined how many private conversations had taken place about me in that kitchen. How many times my presence had been discussed as if I were a temporary arrangement. I returned the deed to its box and locked it carefully. When I came back downstairs, Melissa glanced up. "We will handle the rest," she said, her tone polite but firm, as though I were an elderly neighbor visiting after dinner. I nodded. I did not remind her that the property taxes due in 3 weeks would be drafted from my account. I did not mention the homeowner's insurance policy that listed me as sole insured. I simply turned off the hallway light and walked to the small desk near the staircase where I kept my checkbook and laptop. The screen glowed softly as it came to life. I opened my bank account and studied the automatic payments one by one, reading each line slowly, absorbing the quiet authority of numbers and names. For the first time in years, I felt no urge to defend myself, no need to correct anyone's version of the story. The house did not require my voice to confirm who owned it. It required only my signature. And that realization settled deeper than any argument ever had. The next morning I woke up before sunrise, the way I always had when Daniel was a boy and needed breakfast before school, and I lay still for a moment listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the distant sound of a garbage truck making its way down Maple Ridge Drive. For years, my mornings began with purpose tied to other people. Coffee brewing, lunchboxes packed, reminders about homework or car insurance payments. Now the house felt different, not emptier, but clearer, as if a layer of noise had been removed. I rose slowly, wrapped my robe around my shoulders, and walked downstairs to the kitchen. Melissa had left a note near the coffee maker written in neat blue ink. "Please do not move the new pantry containers. We are organizing differently now." I read it twice, not because I did not understand, but because I recognized the pattern. Small instructions, gentle corrections, subtle reminders that my way was outdated. In the past, I would have waited for her to wake up and explain that I had arranged this kitchen for 3 decades, that every drawer had a rhythm I could navigate in the dark. I would have defended my habits as if they were moral positions. Instead, I folded the note once and set it beside the fruit bowl without comment. I poured my coffee and carried it to the dining room table, where the morning light stretched across the polished wood. Thomas and I had refinished ourselves. I began to review the household bills stacked neatly in a folder. Electricity, water, internet, homeowner's insurance. Each statement bore my name. Each automatic withdrawal traced back to my checking account. I logged in again, this time not just to observe, but to adjust. I redirected the utility notifications to a private email Daniel did not know existed. I removed his secondary access from the online account, something I had granted years ago when he said it would make things easier. My hands did not tremble. There was no anger in the motion, only steadiness. Around 8 o'clock, Daniel came downstairs in his work clothes, tie slightly crooked, car keys in hand. He hesitated when he saw me at the table. "Morning, Mom," he said, careful, almost formal. I looked up and smiled gently. "Good morning, Daniel." I did not mention the comment from the party. I did not ask whether he agreed with his wife. Silence unsettles people more than confrontation ever does. He poured himself coffee and glanced at the stack of envelopes. "You do not have to worry about all that," he said casually. "Melissa and I can handle it." I met his eyes calmly. "It is already handled." That was all. No explanation. No argument. He nodded, unsure how to respond, and left for work a few minutes later. When the front door closed, I felt the shift again, subtle but undeniable. For years, I had mistaken involvement for belonging. I thought that by staying loud enough in disagreements, I could secure my place. Now I understood that ownership did not require volume. It required clarity. And clarity had begun to change the air inside this house. By the end of that week, the atmosphere in the house had shifted in ways that were small but impossible to ignore. I no longer asked what was for dinner, and I no longer stepped in to help unless someone directly requested it. On Thursday evening, Melissa stood at the stove stirring a pot of pasta sauce, while Daniel scrolled through his phone at the kitchen island. I walked in to pour myself a glass of water and felt their conversation pause for half a second too long. We were thinking, Melissa began carefully, about making some updates around here. Maybe repainting, modernizing the space a little. In the past, I would have asked what color she had in mind, whether she planned to remove the crown molding Thomas had installed by hand, whether she understood how much those details meant. I would have defended every inch of the walls as if memory alone gave me authority. Instead, I took a sip of water and nodded. You should always check the property guidelines before making structural changes, I said calmly. Daniel looked up. Property guidelines? He repeated. I met his gaze without raising my voice. Yes. The homeowner association requires approval for certain exterior changes. Interior renovations can also affect insurance coverage. Melissa forced a smile. Well, that is good to know. I could see the calculation behind her eyes, the quiet attempt to measure how much control I still intended to exercise. The truth was simple. I did not need to raise my voice because the paperwork already spoke for me. The following afternoon, while they were both at work, I scheduled an appointment with Mr. Collins, the attorney who had handled Thomas's estate. His office was 15 miles away, in a brick building near the courthouse downtown. I drove there in my silver sedan, the same car Thomas had insisted was too practical but reliable. The waiting room smelled faintly of leather and old books. When Mr. Collins stepped out to greet me, his expression was warm but attentive. Evelyn, what can I help you with? He asked as we settled into his office. I placed a neat folder on his desk. Inside were copies of the deed, recent bank statements, and the current homeowner insurance policy. I would like to review my options, I said evenly, specifically regarding occupancy and liability. He listened without interruption as I explained that Daniel and Melissa had been living with me for 3 years, contributing occasionally, but not formally listed on any ownership documents. I did not dramatize the situation. I did not complain. I simply presented facts. Mr. Collins adjusted his glasses and reviewed the documents carefully. Legally, he said after a moment, the property is entirely yours. Anyone residing here does so at your discretion unless there is a written lease agreement, which there is not. The word discretion settled over me like a steady hand on my shoulder. On the drive home, I felt neither triumph nor sadness, only certainty. When I pulled into the driveway of Maple Ridge Drive, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the front lawn Thomas used to mow every Saturday. I sat in the car for a few seconds before turning off the engine. For the first time in years, I was not preparing for an argument. I was preparing for a decision. That evening I sat alone in the living room after Daniel and Melissa had gone upstairs, the television off, the house unusually quiet except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock near the hallway. I folded my hands in my lap and looked around the room with new eyes, not as a mother trying to preserve harmony, but as a homeowner evaluating what came next. Mr. Collins had been clear. Discretion meant choice. Choice meant responsibility. For 3 years, I had allowed circumstances to blur into assumptions. Daniel moved back in after Thomas passed, saying it would be temporary while he and Melissa saved for their own place. Temporary stretched from months into years. Contributions were discussed loosely, rarely documented, and gradually treated as favors rather than obligations. I had accepted that arrangement because I believed proximity guaranteed connection. Now I understood that proximity without boundaries only breeds entitlement. The next morning, I rose early again and began organizing paperwork at the dining room table. I created a separate folder labeled Residence Agreement. Inside, I placed a blank template Mr. Collins had provided, outlining terms of occupancy, monthly contribution amounts based on current market rent for a 3-bedroom home in our area, and clear expectations regarding utilities and maintenance. I calculated the average rental price within a 5-mile radius of Maple Ridge Drive using recent listings, noting that similar homes were leasing for approximately $2,400 per month. I divided the amount conservatively, well below market value, not to punish, but to clarify. When Daniel came downstairs, he paused at the sight of neatly stacked documents. "You are busy lately," he observed cautiously. I met his eyes calmly. "I am organizing responsibilities," I replied. He shifted his weight. "Mom, you do not have to make this complicated." His tone carried a hint of discomfort, as though complexity itself were an accusation. "It is not complicated," I said gently. "It is defined." He frowned slightly, but said nothing more. Later that afternoon, Melissa approached me in the kitchen while I was slicing apples. Daniel mentioned you spoke with a lawyer, she said, attempting casual curiosity. I did not react to the word lawyer as though it were dramatic. Yes, I answered evenly. I reviewed the property status and liability concerns. It is important to have clarity. She crossed her arms loosely. Are you planning something? There it was again. The assumption that decisions required justification. I placed the knife down carefully and looked at her without hostility. I am planning structure, I said. Structure protects everyone. For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across her face. Not fear, not anger, just awareness that the ground beneath her expectations was shifting. That night, after they went to bed, I drafted a simple letter requesting a formal conversation on Saturday afternoon to discuss household arrangements moving forward. I printed 2 copies and set them on the kitchen counter where they would see them in the morning. There was no accusation in the wording, no emotional language, only dates, figures, and terms. As I turned off the lights and walked upstairs, I felt the difference between reacting and leading. For years I had reacted to comments, to tones, to subtle dismissals. Now I was leading the direction of my own home. And leadership, I was learning, does not require raised voices. It requires boundaries that do not bend. Saturday arrived with a stillness that felt almost formal, as if the house itself understood that something was about to be defined. I set the dining room table with 3 glasses of water and placed the residence agreement folder neatly in the center, aligned with the grain of the wood. At exactly 2 o'clock, Daniel and Melissa took their seats across from me. Daniel leaned back slightly, arms folded, while Melissa sat upright, her posture alert, guarded. I did not rush to fill the silence. I allowed it to settle first. Thank you for sitting down with me. I began evenly. I want us to be clear about expectations moving forward. Daniel exhaled quietly. Mom, we are family. Why are we turning this into paperwork? His tone carried frustration, but also unease. I kept my voice calm. Because family without clarity becomes assumption, and assumption creates resentment. I slid the document toward them. I explained the terms slowly, outlining the monthly contribution, the shared responsibility for utilities, and the understanding that the property remains solely under my ownership. I referenced the average rental rates in our area and emphasized that the amount requested was below market value. Melissa scanned the page quickly, her expression tightening when she reached the section labeled occupancy at owner's discretion. So this means you could ask us to leave at any time, she said. I met her eyes steadily. It means that this is my home, and anyone who lives here does so with respect for that fact. Daniel leaned forward, his voice rising slightly. We thought this was temporary until we could figure things out. We did not think you would treat us like tenants. I folded my hands on the table. Temporary arrangements require timelines. 3 years is not temporary. It is undefined. The word hung in the air between us. Melissa closed the folder and pushed it back toward me. This feels extreme, she said. After everything we have done to help around here. I nodded once. Help is appreciated. But help does not equal ownership. Daniel rubbed his forehead, clearly uncomfortable. Are you unhappy with us? He asked, as if the issue were emotional rather than structural. I am unhappy with confusion, I answered. And I am correcting it. There was no anger in my voice, only firmness. The conversation did not explode into shouting. It did not need to. The tension lay in what was no longer negotiable. After several minutes of back and forth, Daniel asked quietly, what happens if we do not agree to this? I did not hesitate. Then we discuss a reasonable timeline for you to find your own place. Melissa's lips parted slightly, surprised by the clarity. For years, I had softened every boundary to preserve comfort. Now I was preserving stability. Eventually, Daniel picked up a pen. He did not look at me as he signed, but his hand moved steadily across the line. Melissa followed after a long pause. When the papers were signed, I placed them back in the folder without triumph. There was no victory in my posture, only balance. As they stood to leave the table, I felt the shift complete. The air in the room no longer carried uncertainty. It carried definition. And definition, I had learned, is the quiet foundation of respect. The first month after the agreement was signed passed with a politeness that felt rehearsed. Daniel transferred the agreed amount on the first of the month without reminder, and Melissa placed an envelope on the counter with their share of the utilities, her handwriting precise, almost formal. There were no sarcastic remarks about ownership. No casual jokes about who controlled what. Instead, there was distance. Measured words. Careful footsteps. I noticed how Melissa began asking before rearranging anything in the living room. Would it be all right if I moved this chair? She would say, her tone controlled. I would answer calmly, yes, that is fine. Or, I would prefer it remain there. She listened. Not warmly, but clearly. Daniel started knocking lightly on my bedroom door if he needed something, a habit he had not practiced since he was a teenager. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Boundaries had introduced awareness. One evening, about 3 weeks later, Daniel approached me while I was reviewing my bank statements at the dining room table. He stood there for a moment before speaking. I did not realize how much you were covering all these years, he said quietly. His voice did not carry accusation this time. It carried recognition. I looked up at him, not with triumph, but with steadiness. You did not ask, I replied. He nodded slowly, absorbing the simplicity of that truth. Melissa joined us a few minutes later, holding a notebook. We have started looking at apartments, she said, just to see what is out there. I noticed the change in her language. Not planning to stay indefinitely. Not assuming permanence. Exploring options. There are several new developments about 10 miles west of here, I said evenly. The average rent is reasonable compared to this neighborhood. She seemed surprised that I was not resisting the idea. For years, I would have felt threatened by the possibility of them leaving, as though their departure would confirm my irrelevance. Now I understood that voluntary presence is the only kind that has value. We are not saying we are leaving tomorrow, Daniel added quickly. We just want to be prepared. I closed my folder and folded my hands calmly. Preparation is wise, I said. There was no tension in my voice, no plea for reassurance. That night, as I walked through the house turning off lights, I sensed a different energy in each room. The living room felt less like a battleground of unspoken expectations and more like a defined space with clear ownership. The kitchen no longer carried the weight of silent corrections. Even the air seemed lighter, as though clarity had cleared away something invisible but heavy. A few days later, I overheard Melissa speaking to a friend on the phone. It is her house, she said, not defensively, but matter of fact. We should have been clearer from the start. I paused in the hallway, not to eavesdrop, but to acknowledge the quiet evolution of perspective. Respect had not arrived through argument. It had emerged through structure. And as I returned to my room, I realized that the absence of conflict felt far more powerful than any debate I had ever tried to win. 2 months after we signed the agreement, Daniel asked if we could speak privately in the backyard. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn Thomas once mowed every Saturday, and the air carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass from a neighbor's yard. Daniel stood with his hands in his pockets, not defensive this time, just thoughtful. We found a place, he said quietly. About 12 miles from here. 2 bedrooms. It is within our budget. I studied his face carefully. There was no resentment in his expression, only maturity. When are you planning to move? I asked calmly. In 6 weeks, he replied. We wanted to tell you first. The words mattered more than he probably realized. Not because they signaled departure, but because they acknowledged my position. Melissa joined us a moment later, holding a folder with printed apartment details. It is not as large as this house, she admitted, but it will be ours. I nodded slowly. That is important, I said. And I meant it. Ownership changes posture. It changes tone. It changes how you speak about walls and doors and responsibility. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere inside the house became unexpectedly cooperative. Boxes appeared in the hallway. Closets were sorted. Melissa asked me about local utility providers and how to set up homeowners insurance, even though they would be renting. Daniel requested advice on budgeting for maintenance costs and emergency savings. I answered their questions without hesitation, without sarcasm, without reminding them of past misunderstandings. There was no need. The lessons were already embedded in the structure we had created. One evening, while wrapping dishes in newspaper, Melissa paused and looked at me. I think we got comfortable here, she said quietly. Too comfortable. I appreciated the honesty. Comfort without clarity can blur lines, I replied. She nodded, absorbing the simplicity of that truth. On their final night in the house, we shared dinner at the same dining table where we had signed the agreement months earlier. There were no tense silences, no guarded glances. Daniel raised his glass of iced tea and said, "Thank you for letting us stay while we figured things out." The phrasing was deliberate. Letting us stay. I felt a steady warmth in my chest, not because I had won anything, but because understanding had replaced assumption. The next morning, as the moving truck pulled away and the driveway stood empty, I walked slowly through each room. The house did not feel abandoned. It felt restored. The walls carried the same memories, but now they also carried boundaries. I stood in the living room for a long moment, listening to the quiet settle evenly across the hardwood floors. For the first time in years, I did not feel the need to explain myself to anyone within these walls. Respect had not arrived through confrontation. It had emerged when ownership was acknowledged without apology. And as I turned off the hallway light and returned to the kitchen, I understood something even deeper. Sometimes the most powerful shift in a family does not come from raising your voice. It comes from lowering it and standing firmly where you already belong. 6 months after Daniel and Melissa moved out, the house had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. I rearranged the living room furniture one quiet Saturday morning, angling Thomas's old armchair toward the window where the afternoon sun poured in across the hardwood floors. I did not ask anyone if it looked right. I simply moved it until it felt balanced. The silence inside the house was no longer heavy. It was spacious. I reopened the guest room they had used and painted the walls a soft cream color, covering the cool gray Melissa had chosen when she first arrived. As the roller moved steadily across the surface, I realized I was not erasing her presence. I was restoring my own. Daniel called every Sunday evening now, his voice relaxed, less defensive. He spoke about budgeting for groceries, about learning how to schedule maintenance requests with their landlord, about the pride he felt signing his own lease agreement. "It is different when it is your responsibility," he admitted during one call. "I understand that now." I listen without judgment. Understanding does not require humiliation. It requires experience. A few weeks later, they invited me to their apartment for dinner. It was modest, about 900 square feet, but thoughtfully arranged. Melissa had framed family photos along the hallway, including one of Thomas holding our grandson as a newborn. When she opened the door, she greeted me warmly. "We are glad you are here," she said, and this time the words felt sincere, not obligatory. I noticed how Daniel deferred to her in her own kitchen, asking where she preferred the serving dishes placed. Ownership had softened them both. During dessert, my grandson climbed into my lap and asked if I would come over more often. Of course, I told him, and I meant it. I was visiting by choice, not by necessity. When I returned home that night, I parked in the driveway and looked at the house with steady eyes. The porch light cast a warm glow across the front steps Thomas built himself years ago. This house had witnessed grief, tension, growth, and clarity. It had also taught me something I should have known long ago. Love does not shrink when boundaries are drawn. It strengthens. I walked inside and locked the door, gently behind me, not to shut anyone out, but to honor what was mine. I did not feel isolated. I felt grounded. In the quiet of the living room, I sat down in Thomas's armchair and allowed the silence to wrap around me like a calm assurance. I had not needed to argue louder. I had needed to stand firmer. And in doing so, I had not lost my family. I had helped them find their own foundation, while finally standing fully on mine.